Welcome to the AirCon Vault, recordings of the live streams from Airigle's audio conference. These are made free thanks to our sponsors: A Sound Effect, Game Audio Learning, Kilohertz, Audio Kinetic, Sound Cuts, Sugi, Boon Library, Sound Warriors, and Airigle's, the online home for audio people.
I'm Alex Previty, and this is my talk, Game Mixing, Holistic Approaches and Techniques. This is going to be a pretty high-level one, I think, a little bit more introductory, a little bit more accessible. I could talk probably for days about mixing, but I wanted to make sure that I was keeping it pretty brief just so there's plenty of time for questions and stuff and all that. So as for my background, so basically, my name's Alex Previty. I'm a senior sound designer here at PlayStation, and I recently transferred over to the Japan office after working in the California office for about 5 years. Well, literally 5 years to this day. So I've worked on Ratchet & Clank, Spider-Man, God of War Ragnarok, and then now I'm working on Concord and Death Stranding 2, which were both very fun. And, a long time ago, I think I was focusing a lot more on ambience and some global sound design things. But as time has gone on, I kind of focused a little bit more on stuff like mixing and Wwise project management, which is kind of what I'm doing nowadays. So moving forward from that, so we're going to talk about some stuff today. As for the stuff today, we're going to talk about game mixing, ? We're going to talk about defining your goals. We're going to talk about building the road ahead of you. We're going to talk about sharing the road, some various mix techniques, not hanging on to your ego, and knowing your audience. Just give me a quick moment because I have some notes written down, but the way that sharing my tab works, I can't actually see them. So if you just give me a quick second to pull them up, and everything should be well. All right, so moving forward. So game mixing. So back even before video games were even a thing, back before they were even conceived, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, somewhere along those lines, before the first video game ever hit shelves, mixing in general for audio, for sound, was definitely a concept. Even way back in the day, well, first things first, here's me and Mike, doing some mixing on God of War Ragnarok. This is what a game mix might look like now with, sitting in a chair, listening to very loud sound, maybe working in the middleware Wwise. But before modern game mixing, there was definitely audio mixing happening, or mixing in any form, just in ways you might not expect it. Like, for example, a 90-piece orchestra. There's definitely a composition and an amount of players per section and where they're placed in the room, not only from a left to right perspective, but also a depth perspective. Is this going to make, an instrument wetter or quieter? Is it going to be drier and louder? Does it really depend on the size of the instrument and the size of the size of the section? All this stuff is meant to kind of create this giant sound that's more than some of its parts, and in a way, orchestral arrangement and seating and section size and placement. This is all mixing, and this has been done for hundreds of years. Same thing with painting. If you look at pointillism, for example, if you look really close, you see a bunch of brush strokes in different colors, and it's all nice and dandy. Once you actually pull back a little bit, look at the big picture, you see an actual painting. So in some way, this is mixing too. It's just maybe color and tone mixing and not necessarily sonic mixing. So game mixing now is kind of that in theory, but in practice, it's more taking things like Foley, for example. Here's my colleague Joanna doing some Foley for God of War Ragnarok. It's music. Here's Bear McCreary, doing some conducting for the God of War score. It's also dialogue. And here's Sunny and Chris, doing some mocap sessions. And all of this has to, at some point, make its way to the player, which is this little guy here. So mixing in theory now is just taking all of these three things and finding a way to merge them together into one endpoint location for the player to hear. However, it's not necessarily that simple, which I'll go about in a little bit. So defining your goals. if you mix without defining your goals, in some way you're kind of like getting in the car, starting the car, but you don't really know where you're going. You don't even know if there's roads where you're going. So like, why start if you don't have a destination or even knowing how you're going to get there? Like, do you have gas at all? Who knows? So when you're defining your goals, it really depends on, what you're working on too. Are you working on a AAA action adventure game that's cinematic in nature and has heavy narrative elements? Or are you working on a multiplayer game where combat and gameplay clarity take precedence over everything else? Once you know what your genre is and the expectations of the game itself, this will inform all of the decisions from sound design to mix that you make moving forward. And I think that kind of informs the big picture that every little piece is contributing to. So in defining your goals, there's a few important points that I usually like to hit early on in production. Is talk with the stakeholders to really ensure that the game direction is being supported. Whether this is the gameplay director or the game director or the narrative director or even the audio director, whoever it is, you need to make sure that whatever you plan on doing as an audio department, that it's informing the vision of the game, and what idea you might have in your head might not match like the overall goals of the project. So you want to make sure that you're in complete alignment with the creative leadership of the game to make sure that whatever you're doing is aligned with what they want out of the experience. Once you do this, it's also super important to communicate this vision and everything else with the rest of the audio team. I think as an audio leader director on a project, even as a mixer, you need to be completely mind melded with the audio director and the game directors, whether it's narrative, gameplay, creative, etc., to make sure that the vision and goals are always being communicated clearly, so all these micro decisions that your team are making are always being thought of at any given time. And this needs to be easy to refer back to always. It's like having a plastered on your wall like the 10 Commandments, but at this time it's just like, what are the commandments of this audio production for this game? What are the big things we want to hit? What are the things we're keeping in mind? We need to make sure that for the entire team, it's clear, concise, and easy to refer back to. And once you have that, every single decision that you make, from sound design to mix to everything else, needs to go through the lens of the vision of the game. I think there can always be a little bit of dissonance between what we want to hear and what the game really needs. So I think being able to kind of filter all your decisions through that is obviously super important. You're kind of thinking, how can gameplay support the narrative beats of this game? Or how can the mix, support the puzzles and the combat to make sure they're extra clear? Every single decision you make, from the smallest EQ move to the biggest mix move, always needs to be filtered through that lens of what is the goal of this game. So once you get in your car, you need to think about building the road ahead of you. Maybe there's no road yet, but in order to drive, you need something to drive on. When's the last time you got your oil checked, right? Like, do you have air in your tires? Do you got road snacks? Did you clean all the trash out of your glove box? Is anyone coming along with you? These are all things to ask. And yeah, I probably have too many car or road references in this. Probably should have named the title something like The Road to a Good Mix, but alas, it is what it is. So in order to start the mixing journey, you need to really evaluate, what tools you need to accomplish these goals. And I mean early, like mixing starts from day one. You can't just like mix at the very end after all the sound are in the game. It's not like film where you need to wait for picture lock and editorial lock and all this stuff just to make one mix move. Mixing starts from day one, and you need to be having these discussions about what the road building process is going to look like right away. So right off the bat, just start brainstorming. Think about things like, in order to support this vision, is there tech that hasn't been created yet, right? Are there things we need to maintain and develop? Are we going to need to hire extra staff for this? How is that going to work? Do we have enough time built into the schedule to even mix in the first place? What about pre-mix? Is that being factored into it? Does the director need to come to this? There's so many elements of this. So you need to start brainstorming right away just to kind of get your feet off the ground. Once you do this, it's good to kind of create a roadmap of everything you think you might want, right? Even if you don't need it now and can't foresee needing a specific mix feature, you're always going to get into a situation where you're like, dang, like if only I had X or only I had Y. I kind of like the mantra of I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. And I think if you start creating a feature list from high priority to low priority of mixed features you might want, I think everyone can get on the same page about scheduling the proper time to develop and maintain these, and also during mix itself. I think they're super important. So resource planning is another thing too. Mixing can't really be done alone. I think if you mix in a box without contact with anybody else, I think you'll get into a situation where you probably don't want to be in. So making sure you're resource planning to not only make sure you have the staff needed to help sound design or even prop up some of these mix systems from a programming standpoint, but once you're in the mix itself, like who needs to be there, like what stakeholders need to be attending, if we have cinematic mix versus gameplay mix versus music mix versus dialogue mix, like who all needs to be involved in this process early on and during the final mix process in the mix room, for example. It's also really important to designate a point person, because at the end of the day, you kind of need like a lifeguard in the pool. I know it's not a car reference or a road reference, but you need someone who's like sitting on top looking out at the big picture. I think there's various people on a project whose job it is to implement ambient elements. There's people's job it is to make sure that animations are tagged correctly for Foley sound effects. There might be people who are sound designing some of the biggest cinematics in the game, and everyone kind of fits into their own piece of the puzzle to make this game complete. But as for someone who's going to be looking at the mix, I think it's really important to have a point person whose job it is to kind of oversee the direction of everything. In a lot of cases, this could be the audio director or the audio lead, but on some bigger teams, you could have someone separate from those roles whose job it is just to maintain all these systems and to make sure that it's working well for everyone, especially when it comes down to the nitty-gritty elements of keeping the Wwise project intact, for example. If everyone's kind of going rogue and doing their own thing, you could have a mix that's very hard to control at the end of the day. So having a point person that not only creative decisions run through, but also technical ones as well, to make sure everything has what they need and they're keeping the big picture in mind, I think it's really good to have that, in my opinion. Also, a huge thing too, which I've learned a lot about, is just communicate everything through team and other departments. Because once people get their sound into the game, they kind of obey the rules of the mix tech that you have set up in the middleware, in the game engine, etc. And if people aren't necessarily aware of this stuff, you can get into a lot of situations where people are going to be not understanding what they're kind of feeding into. And I think if they're not informed, they might make the wrong decisions about maybe the wrong bus assignment or attenuation, or their sound could be getting turned down or up without any knowledge of what's happening. And not only do you need to communicate the vision to them, high level, but it's also really important to communicate, okay, how is this all working? Even if you're not the one maintaining it, it's still good to maintain an understanding of how everything works. So there's an understanding of kind of the sound going from A to Z, being created in the DAW to being heard at the end. How does that work? What's the audio pipeline? What's the gain staging? What are all the dynamic systems? Making sure this is all tracked somewhere and easily communicatable is also super important. Another big one is asset matching standards. Sound effects are a little more difficult, but especially with VO, where there's tens, hundreds of thousands of assets, I think having some semblance of control over what you're inputting into the middleware also makes an easier output, right? Especially when you have very large teams, it can kind of be very disparate in terms of the mastering style of different kinds of sound effects. And if you have no real standards or best practices for this, once you're actually sitting down to mix, you'll find a large variance of sounds that are hard to kind of gel together. So I think having some semblance of audio mastering standards per team, per category is also super helpful, just to make sure that everyone is doing their part to make sure things are consistent, even from the asset creation level. Also, monitoring levels are extremely important. I'll get into this a little bit later, but you need to pick a monitoring level for your team, assuming you're working on speakers. With headphones, I found this quite a bit harder to enforce. But when you have your monitoring level set up, this kind of dictates how the entire game sounds. So once you choose one that's really quiet or really loud, that could affect the entire dynamic range. It could affect how assets are even authored. including all the mix decisions you end up making. So spend a long time deciding what your monitoring level is going to be. And once you do, really, really stick to it and really, really make sure that everyone else is doing the same thing, just so you're sure that everyone's hearing the game in roughly the same way. Also, keep things clean and elegant. I like to have things set up in a very Scandinavian DIY furniture type way. I think if everything's really esoteric and only you know how it works and it's really complicated, like what if you're sick and you can't show up to work for a few weeks and someone else has to take over the mix? Like, are they going to know what's going on just by looking at stuff? I think Jody, dialogue supervisor, she calls it the hit by a bus clause. Like, if you were hit by a bus tomorrow, would someone be able to open up the project and look through everything and understand how it works? I think setting things up in this way is not only good in these cases, but it makes actually operating the mix a lot more intuitive, and you can kind of work from your gut and hear things quickly instead of having to go through a bunch of tedium just to kind of hear changes. So as an example, here's how some of the dialogue stuff has been set up on projects. So on the left side there, you can kind of see like different queries for performance intensity. So if you have the ability to do this, it's not always feasible, but having a way to kind of like tag lines in the game with various projection levels, and that can inform one of two things. One, it can inform like what's your integrated loudness target for this type of dialogue line. And then from there, does this projection level also inform the attenuation for it, right? Being able to kind of keep things organized in a way where your input standards are the same and your output standards are also the same in terms of what is the asset going into Wwise, what kind of settings does it get, and what does that determine when it goes out? Having a way to kind of like broadly make categories and keep things standardized is really, really helpful. And I think VO is a perfect example because VO is the one thing that needs it the most. Another big thing is the bus structure. This is kind of where mixes go to do battle with all the sounds in the game, right? And if your bus structure isn't set up correctly, you're going to have a huge battle ahead of you in terms of getting everything sounding the way you want. So, of course, naming conventions and color coding are great. I think having naming conventions that are really clear and have easily understandable inheritance is, a huge thing for me personally. But also in that case, I think that you need to keep things really clean and like only make complexity when it's absolutely necessary, right? So like I wouldn't just make buses for fun just because we think we might need it later. I would start as bare bones as possible, like absolute bare minimum. And then if you come to a use case where like, okay, well now for this enemy thing, I would really like to have, the vocal sounds separate from the pain and death sounds, because pain and death sounds might get a different ducking thing happening to it, so they're more audible in the mix for player feedback, right? So I kind of always like only making buses if you can justify its existence with any sort of mixing rule. And not only dynamic mixing, but even 3D audio behavior. Like in Wwise, there's bus configuration. So does this bus need to be 2D and pass through instead of 3D audio or audio objects or ambisonics? Like I would only create complexity if something necessitates it, right? If you work really complex, it's hard to scale back and keep things clean. I think if you work really clean and add on things as you need, luckily software is infinitely modular, so there's no harm in starting off small and only growing as you need. I think that's going to keep things efficient and easier to work with for sure. Another road and driving metaphor, sharing the road. So this is really important because, games have a theoretical, digital audio in general has a theoretical limit, right? Like there's digital zero, there's clipping, and clipping has its time and place. But if someone's playing a game for hours on end, you don't want to be digitally clipping the entire mix into their ears for hours on end. So if you view the kind of headroom of your digital mix as the road, you're sharing the road with Foley, you're sharing the road with sound effects, you're sharing the road with dialogue and music. You all need to be kind of coexisting together in a little happy area, right? So if you're trying to get more room because you need it. Maybe you need to merge over to another lane because something really important is coming up, right? If you don't necessarily communicate that to the other teams, even during production, but at runtime during the mix with Signal, you're going to end up bumping your friends. Maybe Sound Effects has a really cool moment they want to hit, right? There's a really cool explosion that happens because you did this sweet interact and it caused this thing to blow up and you saved the day, whatever. It's really loud anyways. So what's happening to music and dialogue? They're like, well, we're still full scale, so they're just going to get bumped off and you're going to clip and everything's going to be really sad. You don't want that to happen, right? So instead, thinking of sharing the road as kind of being conscious of your neighbors and finding ways to kind of reshape yourself. Oh, maybe I see this person needs to get over into my lane. Maybe I'll slow down and let them over because I see they're going to hit this truck or something. I don't know. Point is car metaphors aside, I think if you're always in constant communication about kind of that juggling process for if we need to move here, what else needs to change shape or move in order to make room for it? Because at the end of the day, you only have so much room to work with if you want your game to be in spec. So finding ways to kind of resize and reshape and juggle things between all of the food groups is super important. Because if you don't do this, you're going to have the whole issue where everyone's fighting to be the loudest thing. And we've all heard things like this before, and it kind of is not necessarily fun. So keeping things consistent and not too loud for the player, I think, is beneficial. I'm going to answer questions as I see them because I'm going to miss them if I keep going. So Gregory asks, is there a Red Book type standard for game sound final mix delivery? Sort of. So there's this audio interest group that Sony either founded or is a part of. I'm not entirely sure, so don't quote me on it. But Gary Taylor and some other folks here at Sony a while ago kind of created like a standards thing, similar to how there's like the ITU standards, there's Dolby standards and all that. There's a game standard for loudness, and I think as it is now, the target integrated loudness for about 30 to 60 minutes of representative gameplay should sit at around minus 24, give or take, plus or minus 2 decibels, with true peaks not going over minus 1. That's kind of like the most simple way I can explain it, and that's really the only thing that's quote-unquote enforced. Of course, there's times in a game where it's going to be quieter than that. There's times in a game it's going to be louder than that. And not all games adhere to this either. But at Sony, I know that we try our best to adhere to this because it kind of creates a more consistent experience. There's not more detailed stuff about like your loudness range and stuff. But I think on average, as long as you're not going over minus 22 integrated over like an hour of gameplay, you're in a pretty good spot. So that's kind of the Red Book standard as I see it. But as listening formats are changing with Dolby Atmos and 3D audio, ways to measure these aren't always as consistent. So it's kind of like a moving target. And as other games get louder, there's like a pseudo loudness war happening. So like it's kind of a hot subject for sure. But I definitely think that we try our best to stay within standards amongst ourselves. So at least we've got a target. And I think it's been working out pretty well. So that's that. Thanks for the question. But yeah, I think knowing that limit and that target, loudness setting you want to hit, like you can't just be louder. You need to kind of find ways to mold the mix around each other instead of just brute forcing everything. So that's kind of this little illustration that I made. One thing that I think is really important is subtractive mixing, right? As you saw in that diagram I made, like you need to get out of the way for more important things. And the most important thing could shift at any time. It could shift for an entire mission, could shift for a microsecond, right? But being able to find systemic ways to do this is super important. Let me pull up my notes again. So one is the sidechain EQ. So if you understand the concept of sidechaining, you're basically looking at source signal, the thing that you want to duck something else. And then you want that signal to duck the volume, or in some cases, the EQ of a target sound. So I think that in that note, volume itself as ducking definitely works, right? Like you've all heard like the classic house techno, sidechain kick. I love that sound. And I think if you're trying to use an effect, volume as a raw way of sidechaining is very effective. But I think as we're trying to make our games more immersive and more filmic and more realistic and stuff, I think we're trying to find ways to make things as transparent as possible. Of course, there's a time and place for bold mixed moves that are in your face, but I guess generally speaking, a lot of people do prefer a pretty transparent mix. So I find that using EQ is kind of one way to make it a little more transparent than if you were just using volume by itself. So I think I see another question in the chat. I'd love to hear. Oh, there's multiple questions. Let me just finish this slide and I'll answer some. So basically, with Sidechain EQ, this is using Wwise. I use Wwise a lot, so all these examples are Wwise related. I'm sorry, there's nothing that for like native Unity or Unreal Audio or Fmod because I don't have a lot of experiences there. So, but I hope you can take these examples and apply them to your preferred middleware, hopefully. So with Sidechain EQ, one method you could do is you can just kind of send your desired sounds, whether it's individual sounds, whether it's an actor mixer, or even better, whether it's a whole entire bus. So I want all player weapons to be sending these signals to this bus. And on the bus level, what we're actually going to do is kind of split that up into three parts, like a low band, medium band, and a high band, for example. But on the meter bus itself, we're actually doing a bandpass plugin to be like, hey, I'm only going to meter just from this frequency to this frequency, or just the low end, just the high end. And that way, you can actually duck stuff. But you don't always need to be ducking, right? A lot of games these days are very dynamic. They're not always loud and proud. There's a lot of moments that are very quiet. And I think sidechain ducking, any sort of ducking, is the most noticeable when you don't really have to duck anything. And, you're still hearing pumping. Like if you have you're hanging out, it's quiet, you hear this nice ambience of a lake, and you hear the lake ambience just getting destroyed whenever someone talks. That's kind of the situation that you definitely want to avoid. So finding a way to only duck when you have to is also really important. Yes, Greg, if you could bundle up the questions in a nice little gift at the end, that'd be great. But yes, so one way you can do that is taking the loudness level of the thing that you want to duck and measuring, well, how loud is it right now? If it's not loud enough to where I really need to duck it, do I need to duck at all? So one of the ways you can do that is, for example, with sound effects. You can measure the overall loudness or RMS of sound effects over time, and that will actually drive the send values of the meters themselves. So when the game is really, really quiet, those meters aren't going to be getting any signal sent to them at all. But when the game is super, super loud, you're kind of getting the full thing. So I think this effect is really helpful. And then, as you can see here, once we get those 3-band, loudness levels sent back to us as RTPCs, we can then take those 3 bands that we're metering and also duck those same 3 bands at our target. Maybe VO is ducking sound effects or it's ducking music. We can then use RTPCs to be like, hey, whatever we're measuring, we just want to suck out the same frequencies. So if someone is really bassy, it's going to pull more low end out of the mix. And if someone has a more high-pitched voice, maybe it won't touch low end at all, just so we're ensuring that we have the most transparent ducking possible. Quick answer, yes. So Sidechain EQ, do you use the bandpass meter values instead of RTPCs and use them for ducking? Yes, I do. Yeah. Bandpass first, then the meter, and then that bandpass value is basically being passed over to this EQ here. So I'm going to show you an example from God of War Ragnarok. Basically, the first video is a more quiet area. It's pretty calm, and you can kind of see on the bottom right-hand side is a screenshot of Wwise that kind of shows the meter plugin and the overall RMS of the ambience, and then it will show the dialogue occurring and how much ducking is happening. And then the same thing happens. It goes to a loud area, and you can kind of see the same thing again.
Gná pledged loyalty to Asgard long ago, and our friendship ended soon after.
What happened?
I made a choice. One she couldn't accept. Kratos. She hates me. She will be a problem for us. Better we find her than she finds us. Gná pledged loyalty to Asgard long ago, and our friendship ended soon after.
What happened?
I made a choice. One she couldn't accept. Kratos. She hates me. She will be a problem for us. Better we find her than she finds us.
So hopefully it sounded like relatively transparent, but that's kind of the idea, is like we don't really need to be doing this kind of mixing all the time. So how can we make the dynamic mixing itself more dynamic? This is kind of one way to do that I think is, I'm interested to explore this more, with more stuff. So here's another example that's semi-related, but it doesn't have the dignity of having its own explanation slide. But in order to push this even further, I think we've all worked on games that are just loud as heck, right? And it's hard to make things cut, especially with dialogue, right? In narrative games, I think dialogue is kind of the most paramount thing. And we're always trying to find clever ways to get dialogue to cut, even when things are hectic. Like, for example, during one of the final boss battles of this epic adventure. So, Thor, if anything, is loud. And he should be loud, but also there's a lot of narrative moments that are being presented during fights. So how do we get this to cut through? And sometimes just that transparent frequency sidechaining stuff isn't enough. So this is a method that actually Mike Kent told me about, and we tried to implement it on God of War, and now I'm addicted to it because it's really effective. But basically, we have a compressor on the sound effects bus, and it's not doing anything. The ratio is at 0 most of the time. But whenever narrative dialogue is happening, it's sending to this meter, and that meter is sending to an RTPC, and that RTPC is sending to the ratio of this compressor. So now when people are talking, it's like, hey, if this sound is getting louder than -24, which is basically where VO sits, I'm going to compress it just so it's not getting louder than the dialogue. So if it's quieter than it, it's not going to touch it at all. So you're not going to hear pumping for quiet elements, even quiet layers of louder sounds. But it's kind of squeeze stuff under the VO just while talking is happening. And I'm just going to play the video so you can hear it. And then you can see in the bottom right-hand corner again, you'll see Wwise, and you'll see the RTPC moving for the ratio when people are talking, as well as the gain reduction actually being active during these moments.
Talking's over! Fight and
You're what the All-Father made you! You can choose to...
You all die! I can take it! Can you?
Yeah, that way just, you're able to kind of feel the intensity of the sounds. And I think in a way, squashing them underneath the sound effects still kind of gives them the intensity without really stepping over the dialogue. I don't know. I think this method is cool. I think even doing this in a multi-band way could be really fun as well. I know there's limitations to multi-band compression in Wwise when you have a lot of 3D audio running, but I think just volume, I think, works. I think going further than that, too, could be interesting to explore. But that's another method I think we like to use to kind of get dialogue to cut. And I think that's kind of the trend, is dialogue is pretty important in these games. And not every game is going to have dialogue that needs to be the forefront, for example, right? But in these games, for sure.
Talking!
Oh, yes.
Talking's over!
Hold on. All right, cool. So another one is the threat system. So with this, we're trying to figure out good ways to have good combat clarity, at least between sound effects, right? So distance is really easy to mix because everything's got attenuation, everything falls off over distance. But that's not always the most important metric in a game, especially during combat, because there could be someone really close to you who you don't really need to know about, there's someone really far away from you that might be firing a ranged attack, and that might be important. So finding ways to mix that isn't purely based off of just distance, which is the primary mixing that interactive games have had historically, but finding other metrics to use that aren't just that. So in this way, you kind of want to find a way to determine the importance of an enemy. And this is the huge one where you can't really just make this inside of Wwise and call it a day. I think it's really important here to kind of like really bolster down the resources to try to make sure this is actually being created in the way you need. So, you definitely got to work with gameplay programmers and combat designers, not only to like help prop up the system and maybe there's metrics they're already using to track all this stuff, but like in order to actually make the system work, it needs a lot of attention and it needs a lot of resources to make sure it's functioning the way you want to. In order for this to function, there's a lot of back and forth work. You kind of punch in all these values and you're like, okay, is this working? Is it not? Is it tracking this? Do we need some way to override it for certain types of enemies? What kind of metrics are being pumped into the system? What kind of scores do they get? Are there any exceptions we need to test? This is a huge thing that needs a lot of back and forth work. So this is definitely one of those things, like I mentioned before, where you really want to allocate a lot of time on the roadmap for if we do feel like this is important and we could use it, like, do we have the resources allocated to actually make it happen? So in order to do this correctly, you always need constant check-ins to make sure that this mix system that you're doing, yeah, it sounds cool, but is it actually supporting, the combat design goals, the gameplay design goals? Like, what do the combat designers think? Is there something that they really want to hear that might surprise you? And how can you tailor the system and the mix to really sell those goals and make it better for the player? So this is an example, surprise, also from God of War Ragnarok. This is where I have all my videos. So in this setup, the way it kind of works is, there's a bunch of enemies loaded in this combat encounter, and they're all kind of given a score every frame. But while we do care about their raw score, maybe we're looking at, are they targeting a companion or are they targeting me? Are they currently attacking right now? Do they have low health? Do I have low health? Are they facing me? Are they behind me? Are they using a ranged attack? Does their attack do more damage? All these things are kind of bundled together to be a final value. However, the issue is if everything has a high value, then you're going to get into the same issue before you even made the system in the first place, where you have information overload. It's kind of like if everything is audible, then nothing's audible, right? It's like the Walla effect. One person's talking, you're hearing what they're saying. If two people are talking, you're going to pick it out between both of them, right? But then if 3 people are talking, 4 people are talking, more and more and more, it just becomes a bed of noise. And that's what we want to avoid, especially in combat, where you do want to know what's happening. So essentially, those scores are like sorted from highest to lowest, and that kind of number of enemies is sorted into buckets. Are they really threatening? Are they not very threatening? So even if they have close scores, it could be in completely different threat areas depending on the relative relationship between them. Anyway, in this video, I just have enemy sounds soloed only. And you can kind of see above each enemy's head, there's like red for high threat, yellow for medium threat, or normal threat. And you kind of hear when they're not as important, and they kind of get to normal or lower threat, association, the mix drastically changes. And I think that's really important for having an audio spotlight on what you actually need to hear. So yeah, you can kind of hear like while the enemies were like fighting Atreus on the left, well, I guess in your case, center, but on the left, like they were kind of turned down quite a bit because in the mix, you don't really need to hear them because they're kind of doing something that you don't really need to know about as much. But what it is trying to do is like say, hey, this person's attacking me right now. They're winding up this big thing that's going to spit, corrosive vomit at you. So watch out, right? That's kind of a way to do that. And I think if you find more ways to leverage metrics that aren't just audio based, but gameplay based, and something even beyond this, that there's tons of options out there. Using gameplay metrics to drive mix to give the player information in ways that go beyond just what's inside of the box is really important. And I think being able to collaborate and allocate time to do it is really important, I think. So this is a big one. Wwise HDR. HDR is a feature that Wwise has that is really cool, but also I think is a little underrated. I don't know if it gets used enough or even to the extent that I think it's really good for, but it's essentially a way to manage relationships between sounds dynamically, right? More than you can just do with metering and sidechaining. So with Wwise HDR, basically the way it works in theory is that if sounds are participating in the HDR system, you can kind of draw an envelope. So here you see a sound in the RMS view, and you'll see some settings you can enable in Wwise, such as the sensitivity of the curve that's automatically drawn, or the active range of the audio. And real quick, I could give a whole talk on this alone, but active range is essentially from the top of the peak downwards, how many decibels of that envelope is it going to actually use? Do you want to use the full thing to get a really big duck envelope? Do you want to use just the top of it for something a little bit more transparent? That's kind of how it works, is whenever you are authoring HDR envelopes, it's not just using ADSR of a compressor and relying on attack time, release time, hold, knee ratio. It's actually looking at the hand-drawn envelope. And sometimes you can do really cool stuff with this that will make the mix a lot more transparent than if you were just doing purely signal-based mixing. So in order to do this, even though HDR uses voice volume, which inherently does have gain staging associated with it, it's really important to kind of talk about in between sonic content that's participating in the HDR system, like what's really important, right? What's not so important. And between those, like how is that relationship managed, right? So you can see on the top here, like we have a rough overview of like different kinds of categories and the ranges they can occupy. But if you were to scroll down really far in the spreadsheet, you'd see that there's like tons and tons and tons of different categories that will get specific voice volumes. That way we can globally manage a sound category's importance relative to each other. And at that point, once you set that up, the game kind of mixes itself. Here you can see like on the HDR bus, which essentially in a lot of games is where a lot of diegetic sounds get routed. We have like a ratio of 2:1, for example, release time, and a threshold of 0. The threshold of 0 kind of means that anything above 0 voice volume wise is going to duck things below it. But how much it ducks something is relative to how much the delta is between that sound and the sound below it. So if you have a sound that's 10 and a sound that's 0, and then the ratio is 2:1, that sound will be 5 dB louder, but it'll duck that sound by 5 dB. It's a little kind of confusing, but once you kind of get how the ratio works, is like with the HDR window. Well, I don't want to spend an hour on that, but point is, I think it's really helpful. However, with HDR and Wwise, like you need to set up really early. But before I explain the ins and outs or some gotchas, I kind of want to show you how it sounds. And this kind of shows you how we can kind of go beyond just the peak values or the RMS values of sounds to do dynamic mixing, right? We can kind of create our own destiny, like Kratos does in the hit game God of War Ragnarok. I'm just kidding. It's a bad pun. But in that game, he does create his own destiny. But we want to do that with mixing too. Like, do we want to have a little more control over how things duck? So here's an example, and I'll just play it for you. So yeah, that's kind of how it sounds in theory. But we would actually work with pink noise when we were authoring these envelopes, because like if you're in the worst case scenario, we're right by a waterfall and you're like doing these moves, like you don't want to hear any sort of pumping at all. So how can we author the envelopes and set all the settings up in a way where all the ducking that's happening is so perfectly tuned to the sounds envelopes that we want to duck stuff that you never notice it as the player? Like that's ideally where you want to be. So basically, in short, it like elegantly manages relationships between sound effects, right? Once you set up your hierarchy, and you can kind of like set up, okay, well, if a player does a huge attack, like that shield smash he did, we want to deduct the mix like a lot, right? But then if he just hits like a little small creature, maybe not so much, right? Finding out what ducks what with the pecking order is really important. And once you set that up, it'll kind of, work itself out. However, you can't just go into a game mix and be like, oh, maybe we want to use it later. And then the last few months, okay, we're going to do HDR now, right? This needs to be done like early. If you need to use it or you want to use it, you need to decide soon rather than later, because it uses voice volume. The issue is gain staging, right? So if you have any sort of upstream gain staging that's going to turn up or down the voice volume of your sound you want to participate in this system, that all takes into effect, from the bus volume all the way down to the voice volume of a single grain. It all plays into a part, this cumulative value. So you kind of need to think about lots of stuff, right? First of all, what is and what isn't included in the system. So maybe we'll decide, okay, all diegetic sound effects will take a part of the system because they're actually happening. But maybe cinematic sound effects, UI and HUD, music, and dialogue will live separate from the system, right? Depending on your game's needs, you can decide whatever you want, but deciding this early on enough is really important. I just saw in a spreadsheet before, I think creating that hierarchy to kind of visually parse out how you want to maintain your relative importance between sounds is really important for the system to make the most of it. Because if you're just using it purely as gain staging, what's loud isn't always the most important, and vice versa. So finding ways to kind of decouple loudness from importance, I think, is really important. And similar to how you want like a point person for your bus structure and for the mix tech in general, it's also good to have someone kind of in charge of how this stuff works. Like if you're determining importance between sounds, like does the audio director agree with that? Does the gameplay director agree with this? Like, are you on the same page? And are sounds being routed correctly? Are they getting the right kind of envelopes drawn? Who's going to be educating the team on the right way to set up all the settings, right? Admittedly, it can be daunting if you don't know how it works. So having a point person dedicated to making sure it's all good is good. But yeah, clear game staging is important too, because if your project is set up in a really convoluted way, you're not going to know what's happening above or below that sound to affect it in a way that affects HDR. So making sure that your project is really, really efficient and clean in a way that makes using this system better is going to make your life a lot easier. Also, if you do want to use HDR, you should be aware of how it affects attenuation and aux sends. So because attenuation uses voice volume, and HDR also uses voice volume, if you have a ratio of 2:1 and the sound that's at 30, for the first 30 dB, so from 30 to 0, that's really 15 dB of actual audible gain versus the 15 dB below it of ducking, right? So if you have an attenuation that goes from 0 to 30, on any other sound, that would be 30 dBs of reduction, right? But on an HDR sound, it would really be 15, because anything above the threshold obeys that ratio. So you have to be careful with that. And also aux sends. If you're taking your HDR signal and sending it somewhere that doesn't have HDR at all, so right, like the output bus of a sound, the bus path, the drive signal path of a sound, is adhering to the HDR rules, the ratios. But then you're sending that sound to a game-defined reverb or a user-defined aux send for something, right? If that's not getting the same HDR rules applied to it, you're either going to have to manually compensate all this every time you're overriding sends, or you're going to have send values that are much louder than your actual drive signal. So You can simply do this just by enabling HDR with the same settings on wherever you're sending your sound, and it'll take care of itself. But it's something to be aware of, because if you don't, bad times can happen. So, other. Here's an other category. So, there's 1,000 things you can do in a mix. In every game, every engine is going to have its own needs and its own ways of doing so. But, some other examples we can talk about more. Just food for thought is like azimuth and listener cone based mixing. I think for the player, you really want to try to confine what they're hearing. If they're hearing everything, I think in mixing, you're not really doing your job correctly. So in terms of tailoring what they're hearing, is it really important to know what they're looking at? Maybe for ambient sounds, like this big factory in the distance, do I really only want to hear it when I'm looking at it, but off screen it's just mudding up the mix? Or vice versa. Maybe there's an enemy off screen who does extra damage to me if they are stealth and sneaking up on me. So do I want to hear their footsteps louder behind me? There's a lot of ways to leverage azimuth and listener cone and other sort of spatially based metrics in order to kind of mix the way you want. The huge one I talked about before is just distance attenuation and air absorption, like how sounds feel and behave in the world isn't only useful for immersing you, right? Does it sound realistically far away? With air absorption, are the low and high frequencies falling off in a way that sounds natural to me? As a player, does it give me the right feedback that something is close versus far? You can also use this during mix and heighten and exaggerate these things to kind of clear out space. Maybe there's a sound that is far away, but I really, really need to hear it because it's going to damage me, like a sniper rifle, for example. Is that going to get a distance attenuation or an air absorption EQ that is exaggerated and not realistic for the gameplay needs? Or if it's the reverse, if there's sounds that are really cool up close, but I don't want to hear them far away, it's not physically realistic, but is this going to help focus the mix to what I need to hear and clean it up by subtractively or even additively mixing things in the way we need? Also, something that's a little bit more common these days is spatially, where is the sound going? Back in the day, you only had to worry about stereo and maybe 5.1 and 7.1. But now, we've got Dolby Atmos on consoles, on both PlayStation and Xbox. I think Xbox, I'm not sure. But we also got 3D audio, like on PS5. And where sound lives, what lane they live in 3D audio, is also really important. So here's like a really crude diagram I made. But for example, on PS5, you have ambisonics, you've got pass-through, you got audio objects, and they all kind of have different sonic qualities and also different advantages and disadvantages, right? With ambisonics, you get a full spherical feeling in imaging, but because of the nature of encoding things to ambisonic and then decoding it to binaural, like maybe there's a little bit of coloration. Maybe it feels farther away. Maybe it's a little fuzzier. I don't know, right? Depends on the HRTF, depends on the technology. And then pass-through, of course, is just bypassing all the 3D audio entirely and just playing right into your earphones. Maybe this is like the equivalent of you listening to a podcast while you're walking on the park, right? Is that the effect you want? Do you want it to just not live in the world at all? Maybe UI and HUD goes here. Maybe music goes here. And then audio objects as well, right? This is really, really pinpoint accurate and doesn't go through the same ambisonic encoding process. So it sounds a lot more pure and it has a lot more better spatial accuracy. But then you're also a lot more limited with resources about how many of these you can use, right? And not all audio plugins in middleware even support audio objects. So you have to compromise what you're doing in order to make this work. These are all questions to ask in terms of how things are set up. So about ego. But during mix, I think it's really important to not lose track of the big picture. Like at the end of the day, everyone's just working together, whether it's, tech artists, QA, production, game directors, sound designers, they're all working together to make a game awesome for the players, right? And I think it's really easy to get lost in the sauce. So number one thing, don't lose track of the big picture. And I think it's okay to also just play a supporting role. I think, everyone's got their time to shine. I feel like it might not be this sound moment. It might not be this level. It might not be this game. But every sound is there for a reason, right? whether it's the loudest gunshot in the game, whether it's the quietest pebble falling over when you grab onto a ledge. Every sound has its place in the mix and in the overall soundscape. And I think learning to let go of wanting, the front seat and wanting the spotlight, and learning how your sounds can support the vision of the game and the mix overall. I think learning how to be okay with playing the supporting role, even just time and time again, or learning how to pass the baton is really, really important. Speaking of the baton, learning to juggle is also really important. Throughout a game, there's different kinds of elements. There's exploration, there's combat, there's cinematics. And this is a constant juggling act between all these different fields, right? Sometimes we're focusing on dialogue during this crucial narrative scene. Maybe the narrative scene is so touching that the music is now the main thing, and I don't care about the sound. And maybe during this one gameplay moment, sound is so crucial that we don't need to hear music at all, or dialogue. So I think finding a way to understand why juggling needs to happen, having justification for supporting these decisions, but also being okay being the one juggled, right? So maybe dialogue is pushing my sound out of the way right now, but there's going to be a time where I have the limelight, and that might change between microseconds, right? It might change across the entire game, but learning how to juggle and pass the baton, I think, is really, really important. Also creating harmony, right? I think you don't want to have an antagonistic relationship with your partners, right? Making games is really hard, as we all know. And I think we're all in it to make the best sounding game, the best playing game, we can, given the circumstances. And I think if we're all always trying to be the most heard one, or we're all trying to be loud, we're all trying to be in the forefront, we're not really letting go of ourselves and trying to serve what the game needs, right? Maybe we're just doing what we want to hear, and maybe every department wants to hear their own department more, right? But learning to work together, even before the mixing stage. Maybe when you're doing cinematics, you need to change how these work at the asset level to sit in the mix better. Even amongst your audio team, maybe I want this sound to be really full frequency because it sounds amazing in the DAW, but in reality, in context, does it need to be that upfront, right? Do it for them, the gamers. That's the big thing, is it's really easy to make the coolest sounding thing that would make yourself proud, that would make your peers proud. Maybe you want to win an audio award. Maybe you want to have someone tweet about it. We're all, human. That's really nice when that happens. But I think when you're spending hours and hours and hours making something perfect, right? Is that really what we want? Is that really what the game needs? Is the player going to notice? So I think learning how to let go of the ego into perfection and doing what is going to make the game feel better, and it's going to move the needle for the player, right? I can spend hours making this reverb have the perfect frequency response to make it sound outdoors. But in reality, is it even going to be noticeable to the player, right? Learning how to kind of shift your perspective is really important. Knowing your audience is a huge thing. Speaking about the gamers, think about what's most important for the player experience, right? You could spend all this time making it sound good in a way you think sounds good. You could be in that rabbit hole, and you could be in that box just making it sound flawless. But at the end of the day, what does the player really need to hear? Is your sound even going to be audible in this section? Do I need to make the most detailed ambience ever if I'm just running through it, shooting things for 3 hours, right? Learning what's going to actually affect the player experience is really important. Also, think about your listening setups, right? Maybe you're mixing the game in this perfect calibrated 7-1 room that's sound treated, everything's great. But, maybe most players are going to be playing this game on Turtle Beach headsets. Maybe they're going to be listening on TV speakers. I think knowing what kind of game you're making, is it a Switch game? Are they going to be playing handheld on the Switch using the Switch speakers? Are they going to be playing a competitive shooter where most people are going to be in headphones? I think knowing the genre, knowing the platform, and knowing your target audience, you need to kind of think in their shoes to know what's going to translate. So making sure things sound good on consumer hardware, right? I think we've all got nice speakers, nice headphones, and it's really important to, monitor flat, measure flat, make sure everything sounds good on the most natural sounding equipment possible. But at the end of the day, if your mixed decisions don't really translate well over consumer hardware, you need to kind of take a step back and actually listen to your game and consumer hardware to make sure that things are actually sounding good no matter what. But it's also good in this case to start big and test small. I think, like I said before, especially once you start dealing with 3D audio and how audio objects work, and it might multiply this plugin from being used twice to being used 90 times, right? It's always good to kind of start really big. Like, what's my maximum format? Is it Dolby Atmos? Is it 7.1? Is it 3D audio? Is it just stereo? Knowing like what your maximum possible target's going to be, making sure everything sounds good and works there, but then not forgetting to test small. It's bad to start small and then test big, and you're like, wait, we don't have the resources to make this happen. It's also bad to do the opposite. We're like, okay, well, like everything sounds great in my Dolby Atmos certified room, but then on someone's iPhone, it's like inaudible, right? Making sure that you're always thinking about every possible scenario. Like I said before, perfect doesn't also always mean best, right? Like if it's perfect to you, if it has the right amount of detail, hits the verb just right, it has the perfect, oomph quality to it. But like maybe in context, asset-wise, mix-wise, it's hardly what this moment needs. I think learning how to be okay with, is this good for the player experience, for the game experience? Can I let go of my own, notions of making it perfect when in reality, perfect is like subjective, right? And I kind of said this before, I'm a little out of order, but not only mix on various setups, but various monitoring levels, right? Let's say if you decided that 70-6 dB is what you're going to be mixing the game at and playing the game at, and that means your dynamic range is going to be sitting a certain way, right? But then most people who are playing your game aren't going to have the luxury of being able to listen to their game that loud, or on the flip side, where they live has a noise floor so high that they can't hear all those small details you have in your perfect little, sound treated room. So making sure you're testing your game at various monitoring levels to make sure, hey, if I'm listening in home theater mode at 79 dB versus listening to a quiet midnight mode, not only does it translate, but do I have the right audio settings here to make sure that players are able to tailor the mix? So I think in this note, it's really important to kind of give the players meaningful menu options, because even if they deviate from what you think sounds perfect, right, what you want other people to hear might not be what players want to hear or need to hear, especially when you keep accessibility in mind. Making sure that your audio settings are not only abundant enough to give people a customized experience that they want or need, but also it's clear, right? Like, we're all audiophiles and professionals, so we understand audio lingo. However, maybe the average player is not going to understand this technical audio jargon. So how can you even set up your audio settings in a way that are more clear and maybe more accessible? Finding ways to simplify things so they give the player enough control, but it's not so complex that they don't really know what they're doing. Finding that middle ground is tough, but I think it's really important, especially for accessibility. Mix plays into that as well. Can Mix support accessibility by making voice really, really audible for people with auditory processing disorders, right? Do we need things like accessibility cues that help tell low vision players where certain things are, right? Being able to support the mix with those type of things is really important as well, and not just for what you think sounds best or even what the game needs, but for the player base as well. Are they going to want, or do they actually need these things? So making sure you dedicate proper amount of time during the mix to make sure all these options work for the people who need them. Some final thoughts, and then that's it. So ABC, always be communicating. I think communicate with your team about what's happening, communicate with the stakeholders to see what the game needs, communicate with the players. If your game is lucky enough to have a back and forth discussion with like a live service game, that's such a great way to get feedback. Hey, is this actually working for you? Even if you don't have that, you talk with play testers to test all these audio features. Is it working for you? Finding ways to always be communicating to get the vision and to, talk about how it's going to be laid out is really important. And I think is really important to me, I've been realizing it a lot lately, is that monitoring level and dynamic range is like everything. there's been times in the past, like, oh yeah, we'll do like 79 dB, or screw it, I haven't done this, but like, oh, like, let's do 83 dB. That sounds fun. But like, that's like a cinema mix, right? Most people don't have a cinema in their home. So I think that's kind of like the effect that people have when they're watching a movie at home, and like all of a sudden this explosion happens, so they turn it down, and someone's talking and turn it back up. Like, if you have an environment where you're sure that everyone is watching the movie or playing the game in the exact same environment, you can get away with that, right? But with games, you can play handheld, you can play in a nice sound-treated room, you can play with headphones, maybe your family's over and they're really loud and you can't hear anything above their chatter, right? I don't know, but the point is you need to make sure that your monitoring level and thus the dynamic range that facilitates is actually working for people. And once you choose that, like, that kind of sets the stage for how your whole game is going to fall into line with each other. However, rules are meant to be broken. I think a lot of this is really important in terms of setting up standards and making sure things are following the book and they're organized. However, if the game's kind of consistent in just that, I think that would be kind of boring. So finding ways to have enough of a structure in place to when you break those rules, you have enough stability to do that and enough ease to actually hear the results easily. I think that seeing where you can set up structure to make the production easier, but then seeing where you can push things a little outside of the box to make a dynamic and interesting mix for the player is super important. And at the end of the day, just trust your ears. You know, the fanciest gear and monitoring stuff, and it can tell part of the story, but at the end of the day, you probably got into sound or dialogue or music or anything else because you enjoyed the audio experience. So I think being able to trust your ears and use your judgment, and that's, at the end of the day, if it sounds good, then it probably sounds good. So that's pretty much it. You know, there's probably a lot more I could have talked about, but it's a big subject. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but you know, I'm always happy to talk about game mixing because I really love it. I think it's a niche topic that I think is becoming less niche lately, but I think it's still really vital. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, I know there's some in the chat that I didn't get to, and if those could be thrown back my way so I could answer them, that would be fantastic. And if you have any more questions, feel free to type it into the chat, and even afterwards, you know, you can find me at my socials down there, and hit me up on any of those, and I'll respond to you happily. We can chat about whatever you want. But I won't say thanks for real until I answer questions. Because it's not really goodbye yet. Okay, so from Florian. Oh, hi, Florian. As native audio seems to evolve to the point where some studios decide to ditch Wwise, UE audio, and real, how should we adapt when it comes to mixing? Yeah, this is a tough topic because I think Wwise has spent a lot of time, and FMod, from what I understand, like tweaking their software in order to facilitate this kind of stuff. You know, even if it's not by design, there's always ways to do it because luckily the software is powerful enough to do so. You know, if we're shifting more to native audio with Unreal or even Unity, for example, or other game engines, I think you end up potentially losing a lot of the in-the-box mixing that you can do quickly with safe iteration. So I think that, for example, I know that the Sweet Justice Swedish Tech folks have a really cool HDR system that runs completely in native Unreal that is really, really next level. I haven't had the privilege of using Unreal's native audio before, but I really want to test that out. I think if you go to their socials and their website, they have some videos demonstrating it, but I'm pretty sure if you talk to some of them, they'd be happy to kind of give you a demo. But I think right now, native engine audio is at a really unique place. I know with some custom engines out there, they actually have their own mix systems that are built from the ground up just for their engine. And I think that if you're not using middleware, it takes a lot more resources to do so. So I think if you want to go that route, you can kind of create your own path forward, but understand that it is a lot of work to do so. Magnus says, I'd love to hear how you've worked with setting team-wide monitoring levels. Is there a usual sweet spot for you and your team that you found? And working remote, how have you solved this? So yeah, I think for me personally, this is just my preference. on speakers in a medium-sized, small-ish room. I don't have dimensions for you. There's like a whole guide out there. But I think that 75 or 76 dB to me, or really anywhere between 74 and 76 to me, feels really good because it's loud enough to feel the power of loud sounds, and it's not so loud to where it's like unrealistically attainable for like the consumer. So I kind of like that sweet spot. I think it kind of puts out mixes using your ear that are naturally dynamic, but not overly so, right? However, when you're working remote, it's really difficult because everyone's got different size rooms. Like my room here is a lot smaller than my office at work. A lot of people work on headphones like I normally do. So doing that is really hard. I know that my colleague Mike has a way to kind of play a loud sound and a quiet sound. You know, when you're playing a game and like you have that slider of like, turn the slider till you can barely see this logo, and then turn up the slider till you can barely see the logo to get your like shadows and highlights for like HDR, for example. That method can kind of work for headphones. You play noise until you dial it in, right? You can also like monitor headphones with like in-ear mics, but that's like also expensive and difficult. So I can't say that I've quite figured that out yet. And if anyone has any bright ideas about how to keep monitoring consistent across different, setups like that with headphones, I'm all ears, literally. Lewis says, how are you handling the envelopes in HDR for multi-layered sounds? Is there a key layer of the sound used for the envelope? Yes. So there's a lot of cases where there's like a multi-layered sound. A big one's like a gunshot, right? There might be like a body layer, a mech layer, a tail layer, or even explosions. You have debris. You might have an LFE sweetener. So picking like your main one that has like the most recognizable sound and using that to be the transient driver. So what I'll do, like, let's say if they're all in a blend container and they're all playing at the same time, they will all have that voice volume value at the parent level, so they don't duck the other layers of the sound, so you can hear them in parallel, but only the important one with the envelope actually has active range enabled in the HDR settings. So that layer is the only thing actually actively ducking things. The other ones are just along for the ride in parallel. But in the same breath, you can actually have lower relative values for layers to get actual ducking. Like maybe you want your debris layer to be ducked by the transient. You can give it a lower relative value than the explosion main layer, so you have kind of a pump happening to kind of clear some space out for your transients. But yeah, I usually just do pick one main layer and have that be the HDR envelope, and then everything else kind of falls alongside of it. Another question. You mentioned earlier about having asset mastering standards. What LUFS or decibel values were working with at an asset level, e.g. combat versus ambient versus dialogue? Yeah, so dialogue luckily has their stuff together, and they have a really rigorous set of standards for dialogue, especially what you record at, but definitely what you are mastering at and importing into the project, and then how it sounds after that. Usually when it's done right, you don't have to touch any volume for dialogue at all because it's already mastered perfectly, right? So I know with like dialogue, spoken can be anywhere from -26 to like -22, but shouted dialogue maybe can be -20 to -18 or even louder. It really depends. I don't have those numbers offhand, but around there. But for sound effects, it's a really tough one because everyone works so differently in the DAW. I think what we've normally been doing is like, let's just do peak normalize for these sounds, make sure they're limited properly and then peak normalize them to like -1 or something. But for ambience, it doesn't really work because for peak normalizing like a little tiny water drip, it's going to be super, super loud in the game, right? And you're going to have to turn it down to like -50 to even be tolerable. So usually with ambience or like quiet looping sounds, I try to like hit like an integrated loudness target of maybe like -30 something ish, but it's hard to author it that loud, like if you're peak normalizing stuff. So I kind of author ambience like what sounds comfortable to my ears, and I'll just export it that way. But I have found that in Wwise especially, if you enable loudness normalization in Wwise on like a parent actor mixer, for example, maybe I want all my ambience to, I don't care what I bounce that out as, once it gets imported into Wwise, it'll get normalized to minus whatever, integrated, right? So that way, no matter what I've been doing that day in terms of my assets, they're all going to go in at the exact same level. So that way, I'm sure that minus whatever on the voice volume slider is exactly the same feeling. And mixing is a lot faster that way. So I think with like high quantity sounds that need to be similar in sound, like volume level, like ambience is one. I think Foley's helpful too. I think non-destructive normalization in Wwise is a good way to go about managing that. But yeah, I think it could be better, like actually monitoring and standardizing how we export our assets. I know that Loic, who works with us here at PlayStation, has a really, really good guide for this. And I think he gave a talk at GameSoundCon 2022 with Rob Bridget, and they talked about a lot of the stuff in a little bit more detail. And I think that's, if you haven't caught that talk yet, I don't know how you can access it now, but it's really worth watching because there's a lot of good details about that kind of stuff in that talk. Let's see, any more questions? Yeah, how to be consistent with volume levels across multiple different environments. That's a tough one. I mean, there's like two aspects of that, right? It's volume levels as a sound designer. You know, maybe my air conditioner is really loud and I have headphones on that are open back, and that's affecting what I create, right? But maybe the user is able to encounter a multitude of different environmental factors that are affecting the mix. I think it's really important to, as a sound designer, being cognizant of your environment and your listening level. You can't always have the luxury and privilege of having a really good setup or equipment or a space with a low noise floor to mix audio in. So I think it's always good to be cognizant of that. I had a coworker once who had like a hearing thing, and loud sounds would like trigger it, right? It's some ear pain. So they would like monitor really, really low. But then I noticed that the assets they were pumping out at the end of the day and importing to the project were like really, really compressed. I think being cognizant of this stuff and trying to like know your environment can help you author in a more natural way. But yeah, as I said before, like the player, right? Like they could be in any environment. So making sure that you have enough settings there with dynamic range to tailor to their environment. Like I often will play on a lower dynamic range mode just because, you know, maybe the AC's on, maybe my daughter's running around the house yelling. So I want to be able to hear all the details. So maybe I'll choose this, but maybe that's not the most optimal, perfect sounding setting, but for me it works, right? Making sure you have enough options to do that and that you've tested them. Let's see. I got time for one more question, and I want to cut you all loose so you can go to the next talk that's happening. Right. So hoping I'm saying your name correctly. Maxim says, do you start mixing only when all of the assets are ready, or do you start early to get yourself a bit ahead? Yeah, I start mixing like instantly, right? Like even if I'm importing temp assets, I want them to go into an ecosystem that's functional and I'm able to tune and kind of see, oh, this is working, this isn't working. Okay, this is working, but I want to do this with it instead. The earlier you do that, you have a lot more headroom and a lot more time to actually make them what you need them to be. If you wait until all the assets are done, like the assets can inform the mix, yes, but the mix can also inform the assets. So I think the earlier you're actually trying to build these systems, prove them out, getting the right eyes on it, getting the right dialogue happening, getting the right personnel, maintaining these systems. I think even before you get any single final asset into the game, I think getting these propped up early is really helpful, or else you're going to be really in a bad spot later in production. Anyways, okay, I think that's time. I really appreciate everyone coming to my talk today, and thanks for everyone putting this together. I know AirWiggles is a really awesome place to be as a sound designer, and I think AirCon is great. So I'm really excited to be a part of it this year. I really think it's exciting to be able to share knowledge and also hear what all the other people have to say. There's also really cool guests here that have a lot of really cool insight, I think, for everyone. So I'm excited to also get in myself, to listen to some stuff and hear some great talks. But and if you're catching this in a recording, thanks for watching my recording. And yeah, I will hopefully see you all digitally later. And thanks for coming by. Bye-bye.